Thinking about Luke, since it's the last class, I want us to kind of understand where we're at in the book when we dive into chapter 6, because we're going to be gone for like 3-ish months or however long it takes Galatians to finish. So when we come back, we understand where we're stopping, right? So as Luke is talking or writing, what is he doing? Why is he writing his letter?
So that the author would have an orderly account.
Right, so that Theophilus, his audience, would have an orderly account of the things that has already happened, right? So he is writing to a Christian who has already believed in the gospel, and he is writing this letter, right? So these events have already happened, and he is encouraging and strengthening a Christian so that he may know with certainty the things that he was instructed. How important is it for us to be certain of our faith in Christ? What happens if our faith is not certain in the things that have happened? If we are questioning whether or not Jesus actually came and died for us? Yeah, we get 2 Peter, right? Is it true that he actually came and died for you? Because if that really didn't happen, then there's no point in us being here. There's no point in us trying to strive to live righteously. So Luke is trying to encourage and strengthen his brethren to make sure that he knows with certainty Christ died for you. That's Luke. The God of heaven sent his only Son to do the only thing that he can do, and that is save us from our sins, to seek and to save the lost. That is what Christ did for you, Theophilus. That is what Christ did for you, brethren. That's what he did for me. And so as he's writing Luke, he is painting the life of Christ orderly so that he understands with certainty the things that were done. And then he moves on into the book of Acts, and he is writing an orderly account of the things that have happened for the church, so that when Theophilus reads and understands this, he can go and teach it to others. When we read and understand the book of Luke, we can teach the life of Christ with an orderly account and know for certain that these things actually happened. Event after event, eyewitness after eyewitness, example after example, giving us a better understanding that what Christ did for us is the best thing that we have. Don't forget that. Right? That's the book of Luke. So as we traveled through the chapters so far, chapter 6, not a whole lot of, it doesn't seem like a whole lot, but Luke writes a lot, right? The first chapter was 80 verses, right? That's a long chapter. He is very detailed, probably because of his occupation, right? He was a physician. He was very detailed in what he was writing so that we have no doubt what happened. So you have what we've already gone through. Wow, 7 minutes and I'm out of breath. All right. Yeah, take a breath. All right. Page 31 is where I'm at. Thinking about what we've already gone over in the first 5 chapters, how has Luke started his letter? Where did he start in Luke chapter 1? All right, because the beginning is going to be the most important because it describes what? If you know anything about literature, what does the beginning of a book start with?
It gives you the reason for writing.
The reason for writing, right? It gives you the setting, the audience, what he's going to be talking about for the rest of the book. So how does he start off his book? You have the audience, right? And then he moves on into
The beginning, the birth of the forerunner.
The birth of John the Baptist.
right, the prophecies of John the Baptist and Jesus Christ. That's how he starts his book off. God's power to foretell events. That's pretty awesome. Because what have the Jewish people been looking for 400 years? A king, the Messiah. That's just God not talking to him for 400 years, right? But then you have all the way back to Abraham. And then all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, God has been foretelling what's about to happen. And then he moves on into Christ's preparation. After Christ and John the Baptist are born, we have the reason for John's whole being, right? The forerunner preparing the way for the Christ. And what was John preaching? Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Does that sound familiar? Of course it does, because that's exactly what Christ preaches. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Prepare yourself for the kingdom, because this is what God has been planning since the beginning. It's here. It's now. It's happening. Pay attention. Chapter 3. Chapter 4, we have Christ's preparation for his ministry. Christ is preparing to live out the rest of his 3.5 years here in chapter 4. And what happens in chapter 4? He's tempted in the wilderness. And we've gone over these different temptations, and they pop up in his life time and time and time again. All the way up until the end, when the people are crying, "Save yourself if you are the Son of God." It sounds exactly like what happened in chapter 4 when Satan says, "Cast yourself down if you're the Son of God." Preparing himself for what he's about to have to endure. And then we had chapter 5. And chapter 5 was him gathering disciples, right? He started his ministry there in chapter 4, going to Nazareth, and we had those two responses. You either reject the gospel or you're going to accept the gospel. His hometown rejected the gospel, so he moved on. And you have people accepting the gospel. And then you have chapter 5. He's going to have to die. So what does he do? He's gathering disciples to teach them what they need to do and how to teach, for that when he's gone, his mission can continue. And what is his mission? To seek and to save the lost and to preach the kingdom. What is a Christian's duty here on earth? To seek and save the lost and to preach the kingdom. So he's gathering disciples in chapter 5. We have his power over sickness, his power over I don't think death is here yet. Nature, sickness, demons, chapter 4. We see Christ's power as the Son of God. That's how he starts his book off. Very strong, very powerful, so that when we get into chapter 6, and he's going to be teaching his disciples how to operate or how to teach, they can look at his life as an example, because he's already been doing it. Right? What is his, what is that word I'm looking for? What is his pattern already that we've seen in chapter 4 and chapter 5? Christ's pattern. On the Sabbath, he goes to the synagogue, he teaches and he heals people. That's what he does. And so when his disciples see his life, they can imitate it. Right? When Paul says, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ," what was Paul doing? Teaching the kingdom, seeking and saving the lost, and healing people. Bringing people to God. That's exactly what Christ did. That's exactly what the book of Luke is going to explain. Event after event, eyewitness after eyewitness, account after account. We get into chapter 6, no different than chapter 5. And he's going to start training his disciples. He's going to start to train his disciples to do what he does. If someone would please go ahead and read for us verses 1 through 5. Luke chapter 6, 1 through 5.
Now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first, that we went through the grain field, and the disciples took the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" But Jesus answered to them, he said, "Have you not even read this, what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he went into the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those who were with him, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat." And he said to them, the Son of Man is also the Lord's Sabbath.
Awesome, thank you. So we get into chapter 6, and we have this debate, right? And what is Christ doing? What does it say he's doing?
Well, he's talking to the Pharisees.
He's eating, right? It's a Saturday, he's hungry, he goes to the grain field, he picks them off, he rubs it in his hand so he can eat it. That sounds harmless, right? Should be, right? Because what was the purpose, or what was the commandment for people who had fields back then?
To leave grain out for people that were hungry.
You had to leave the outer edge alone. You cannot harvest that because that is for travelers, for the poor, for people who need to eat. You leave that for them. Don't harvest that. That's not for you to give. So as Jesus is traveling, he has the opportunity to take a handful of grain and rub it in his hand. Oh, but it's the Sabbath day. And what do the Pharisees have an opportunity for? Boy, howdy, they have a field day, right? They have this tradition from their fathers, you cannot work on the Sabbath. Because in the Old Testament, what was the Sabbath for? It was a day of rest. But what did the scribes and Pharisees and the fathers do?
They just be reading and writing and doing all kinds of stuff.
Well, what did the tradition for the Sabbath end up being?
A day of no work.
You cannot walk you can only walk a certain amount of paces, like 500 or something. And if you walk past that, sin, because it's work. Here, you cannot rub your hands. That's sifting wheat. That's work. You can't do that. That's ridiculous. How are you supposed to eat? Well, you're supposed to, on Friday, prepare everything so that when you get to Saturday, you don't have to do anything. The traditions of men. Trying to be over God's law. If you go and read the book of Matthew, that's exactly what Matthew's point to the Jewish people is. You have this preconceived mindset that what your fathers have been teaching you is correct. Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. You have heard it was said this way, but I'm telling you this is what it actually means. Absolutely wonderful study to go through. Christ trying to rewire their brains to actually obey God rather than man. And so we have this event here of Christ in the grain fields trying to eat some grain, and we have the Pharisees throwing a fit. Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? You're working. You are sifting grain. And he answers in verse 3, have you not even read this? What is a Pharisee? A what? A lawyer. A person who knows the law. Their entire life is reading and understanding the law. And Christ says, have you not even read? That's like telling an artist, have you not even painted? This looks like trash. That's what he said. Have you not even read? That is their entire life, is to read and know and understand the law. And this is going to rile them up. If this doesn't boil their blood, they have something wrong. Because that is their entire job. Have you not even read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him. How he went into the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those who were with him. I think we went over that in 1 Samuel. When did we go over 1 Samuel? That was a long time ago, right? I know you went over 2 Samuel. Was that right before that? You went over 1 Samuel. Who here was here for 1 Samuel? I don't think I was. Okay? He brings up this event in 1 Samuel where David is hungry, he is traveling, and he goes to the temple and eats showbread and gives some to his companions. What's the problem?
It's for priests only.
I'm sorry?
It's for priests only.
It is for priests only. And what is the consequence of someone coming into the temple and eating the showbread?
Death.
Death. That is the consequence for someone who is not a priest to come in and eat the showbread. They deserve death. So why is David not dead on the spot? That is what is actually unlawful. As a king, God required them to write their own law, to rewrite the law so they have their own personal copy. That's in the book of Deuteronomy. If you are a king, you rewrite the law so you have it. David should know better. So why does he get to do this if it is unlawful?
Because he was kind of had to die. He's hungry.
Because God is the God of mercy. He is in control. Which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he said to them, the Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath. I know the law because I made it. That's what Jesus said. I know the law because I made it. So how are you, a Pharisee, a mere man, going to tell the Son of Man, the Son of God, you are doing something unlawful? That's pretty much what it boils down to. So he's comparing what he is doing, eating food on the Sabbath, to David, who actually sinned and deserves death, and comparing those two options. That's pretty wild. Someone who is not actually sinning, you are saying is sinning, and yet you excuse David's sin. Because that's what they are doing to themselves, to the people around them. Their hypocrisy. Right there in plain sight. Jesus Christ knows what is right and wrong, and he is going to do what is right. He's also using this time to expose traditions of men. To the Jewish people, this is their entire life. Obey the law, keep the commandments, wait for the Messiah. And he is pretty much throwing that out on the table and saying, this is the law, I am the Messiah. At this point, he already has followers, right? He already has the fishermen. He already has Matthew the tax collector. They are here witnessing this event, right? So he is starting to train his disciples to do God's law, to obey God's law rather than man's law. Yes, sir.
I was going to say, back in Exodus 20 is where it's found about the law of the Sabbath. The law was written for the nation of Israel. They were the ones who owned the land or else were hired to work the land. They were not allowed to do their work on Sabbath day.
Right.
But they were told to leave, like you said, leave the corners and all of their fields for the travelers and the poor. And they were not bound by that because they could not go and gather while others were in the field, gathering. So if they were hungry, they could get it right then, rather than having to go get it the day before and prepare it. Because if they were traveling, they may not have had a place to prepare it.
Right. Yeah, bringing up the book of Exodus, having that law of the Sabbath, to where they're not supposed to harvest the outside. They're supposed to leave that for those who were traveling, for the poor, those who needed it. Another great example of that is the book of Ruth, right? The book of Ruth shows a great example of what was going on with that law, where Ruth was going behind the harvesters and picking up what they were required to leave. If you were harvesting and something fell on the ground, leave it. That's for somebody else. Okay? And then Boaz goes above and beyond and actually tells them to pile it up so that when she comes through, she doesn't have to work as hard. She can just pick up those bundles and take them back home. Absolutely lovely book. But we have Christ teaching and doing something that the Jewish people were not going to do. They were not going to stand up to the scribes and Pharisees because they should know the law. Why is somebody who studies the law going to tell me something that is not lawful? That doesn't make sense, right? But also because they'll tax you extra if you try to question them, okay? So he is teaching, he is preaching, he is letting them know, I understand what is lawful and what is not. He is training his disciples. And we have another event here. Again, Luke likes to write in couplets, right? Groups of 2 or 3. Because by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, what is it? It confirms what you're saying, right? They didn't have tape recorders. They didn't have video recorders. So they had eyewitness accounts. He's going to bring up another Sabbath event here. Someone go ahead and read verses 6 through 11 for us.
Now it happened on another Sabbath also that he entered the synagogue and taught. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts and said to the man who had the withered hand, Arise and stand here. And he arose and stood, and Jesus said to them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? To save life or to destroy? And when he had looked around at them all, he said to the man, Stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus.
Awesome, thank you. So we have another event on the Sabbath, right? And what are the scribes and Pharisees, or the Pharisees, waiting to do? Attack Jesus, right? They are sitting around waiting for Jesus to do something. They couldn't find anything better to do with their lives than to sit and watch this man on a Sabbath day.
I feel like that's a lot of work to do on Sabbath day.
Yeah. That's a lot of work to sit and to watch somebody do something and wait for something to happen. Right. Bringing up people today, we have a great thing called the internet. It is a great thing because we can use it for good, but most people don't. And so people who sit there and wait on social media to nitpick other Christians, you led this song wrong, you did something wrong in worship, you're doing something wrong with your life, sitting there waiting to attack somebody. It's pretty much what's happening, right? And so the Pharisees are waiting. The scribes and Pharisees are watching closely. They are making sure they don't miss a single thing so that when Jesus does something good, they can turn it against him. I'll get to that in a second. Yes, sir.
I feel like the lesson we can learn from Jesus here is that a matter of patience in a sense, because a lot of times today we'll see somebody being treated like Jesus is right here, him just living his life, and people trying to do anything they can to break him down or whatever, and that gets our blood boiling and things like that whenever it's, even if it's not us.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it is us, we completely lose it. Whereas Jesus, he stayed content and he taught them.
Right. That attribute of patience being taught by Christ. People sitting there waiting to tear you down, and yet he teaches, right? So we have this idea of people watching closely to wait and attack and tear down something that you're doing good to turn it to evil. Has that happened to anybody here?
I do it to every one of these guys.
Right. Some people call that guilt tripping. Where's Betty? Sorry. Right. So it happens. People are awful. People like to turn good into evil. because Satan likes to do that. Right? One of my favorite books, 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 11. Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak evil against you, or when they speak against you as evildoers, they may in your good works which they observe glorify God in the day of visitation. What the scribes and Pharisees are doing to Christ is what other people did after he dies to Christians. In 1 Peter, that's exactly what he is describing. People are watching closely and waiting to turn your good works into evil so that they can shoot you down and get rid of you because it's uncomfortable for them. Right? And these are Christians eating Christians there in 1 Peter. That's actually the Gentiles. That's 2 Peter. That's other Christians. But when a Christian is doing good, who's usually right behind, waiting to attack? Satan. When a Christian is trying to do good, Satan is always right there, ready to trip you. It's not great. But who is glorified when good things are being done? God is being glorified. Even if the rest of the world thinks, wow, that's awful. Why are you harping so much on this particular point of the law when you can just let it go? Let them live their life the way they want to, and everybody will just be fine. Why can't we have instrumental music in our worship? Why are you harping so hard on this particular point of the law? Because what happened to Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus chapter 10?
Yeah, consumed by fire for offering unholy fire to the Lord.
They were consumed by fire in the midst of the entire congregation because they did not worship God properly. That's why. God has a specific way things need to be done in order for us to get to heaven. We talked about that this morning in Romans. Faithful obedience so that we can gain that inheritance. That's why we harp on that so much. That's why we stick closely to the law. That kind of seems like what the scribes and Pharisees are doing, isn't it? Aren't they? Shouldn't they be glorified for what they're doing? Sticking so closely to the law. Because it's not the law that they're sticking to, it's the traditions of their fathers that they're sticking to. And so that's what Jesus is trying to uncover for the people and for the disciples. Don't focus so much on tradition. Focus on the law. Focus on what God said rather than what man said. We have this Sabbath here, verses 6 through 11. We have another event of Christ healing somebody that cannot be healed by any other person. We already talked about this in chapter 5, right, with the paralytic. This event almost sounds similar, but rather than the legs, it's the hand. In verse 8, he knew their thoughts and said to the man who had a withered hand, arise and stand here. He is making an example. We've already talked about how Christ knows the thoughts of the people around him, right? He is God. He understands what people are thinking. We've already seen it in past events just in the past chapter. He knows what they're thinking, and he's going to expose their thought process. I will ask you one thing. Christ likes to ask questions, right? I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? Anybody want to answer that? Good, right? I mean, that's any day. That's any day of the week. It's better to do good than evil, right? Is it better to save a life or to destroy it? It's to save a life, right? It was a rhetorical question because the other answers are ridiculous, right? The other answers don't make sense. They're having a problem because it's a Sabbath day. That is the only reason they're having a problem with this, is because it is a Sabbath day. They should not be doing work. He shouldn't be rubbing his hands together, and he most certainly shouldn't be healing people. It's a Sabbath day. Stop doing stuff. That doesn't make sense. And when he had looked around at them all, right, he has posed this question, this man with a withered hand, is it better to do good or to do evil, to save or to destroy? He waits for their response. They're not going to answer because it's ridiculous. They're going to condemn themselves if they answer. He does this a lot. He said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he heals this man's hand in front of everybody, the scribes, the Pharisees, and most importantly, his disciples. Has anybody here ever had a great teacher? Someone who, when you think about in times past, when you picture a teacher and that's the first face that pops up in your head. He knows how to get my attention. That's Christ. Right? He said Jesse, so I'm blushing. Okay. He is getting their attention, right? I don't know if any of y'all ever fallen asleep during a worship service. But if a preacher doesn't get your attention, what are you not doing? You're not paying attention. You're either on your phone or thinking of something else. Right? Christ is getting their attention so that all eyes are on this man. And I don't know if you've ever seen somebody with a withered hand. It doesn't look great, right? It doesn't look great. But, I mean, just picture it. A man with a withered hand being able to stretch out his hand so that it looks like the other one. That's pretty amazing. That is what Scripture calls miraculous. Stretch out your hand, and he did so. And his hand was restored as whole as the other. And what is their response? They are filled with rage. What does that tell you about their heart? Good is being done, and they are angry. Who here gets angry when something good is being done? Hopefully not us, right? Satan. Satan is angry when good's being done. I don't want to get too much into it, but if you get angry because good is being done, you might want to check yourself. You might want to analyze your heart because good is being done. You should be excited, right? I got 1, I got 2, I got 3. I love hands. Yes.
I love this because this is the final. So we've noticed before that Jesus shows his power over nature, and then he shows his power over disease and death. And then he shows his power over the law by showing his power over the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. And at that point, he's shown that he has power over all things, and they are not happy. And I love this point because now, from here on out, he starts really teaching. We have the Sermon on the Mount. He really starts teaching things that flip everything that they know upside down.
Right.
And from here on out, he has a lot of this he has to do in secret because they're at this point he's shown his true power over all things, and they are after him.
Right. Yeah. Before, Christ has been telling people, don't say anything, because if word gets out, he's going to have this happening. How they are discussing how they might, what they might do to Jesus. How they are going to destroy him and get rid of him. Because he is pretty much turning their whole life upside down. Right? He has power over sickness, death, demons, sin, the law. He is God. That he has shown them in complete totality that he is God. He has control. And their response is anger and how they might destroy him. Doesn't make sense, but people do that today, right? Yes, ma'am.
I was thinking it's definitely their pride that's being hurt because they have their way that they've done their whole life and their authority that they're teaching people, and now here comes Jesus and he's messing everything up in their minds. And so I could definitely see why that would make them furious, because that's their pride being wounded, that, yeah, you're definitely in the wrong here, and that hurts them.
Right. The characteristic she's pointing at is that idea of pride. Right? We are the teachers. We are doing it a certain way, and Jesus is doing it completely different, right? And so they are furious about what is happening. Excellent point. Yes, ma'am.
It just spoke to me in a way that not only is they're upset with him doing good, but it's a miracle. Like, they're witnessing, they've been used to trickeries and sorcerers and stuff, but they understand they're actually witnessing a miracle. So that just goes more like kind of what Malin and Aaron both were saying, just their pride, that they're upset that not only the good's being done, but it's in more miraculous ways that they've never witnessed and can't replicate.
Right. They are witnessing miracles that should be awesome, right? Their problem is that this has happened before. People have said, I am the Messiah, I am the one that has come from God, and yet it has fallen through. Some people literally falling off the temple because they're trying to prove something. Christ is literally proving it with miracles, and they can't accept it because he is a son of a carpenter from Nazareth. It's not who they were expecting. It is not their preconceived mindset of who the Christ should be, and so they're furious, right? Yes, sir.
I really feel like the Sabbath was in a sense a religious day, and you'd really think that him glorifying God by doing these miracles and teaching, that they would be happy about that.
Right.
Rather than that just shows they're not doing it for God, they're doing it for themselves.
You're right. Yeah, they almost hold the Sabbath day more holy than the Day of Atonement, essentially. Their worship to God, they almost hold the Sabbath higher than that, and they should be happy that good is being done, and yet they are furious. I had a hand here.
Yes, I love how to the Pharisees and stuff, that's rhetorical questions are pretty much blast that, you know what I'm saying, put them on blast, but I can't say that every example in this chapter that he shows his power over, all the examples you said, disease, this, and that, and he did every single one of them that I've ever read in the Bible, he did it with love and peace and the goodness of ways.
Right.
When he showed that power over every single one of them.
Right. He's using love and the compassion of God to heal all these people, and yet they are filled with rage. Right. I have. Oh my word. All right. We got 4 minutes. All right. We got 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. You got a minute apiece. Just kidding. Back here. Yeah. No. I think your hand. Whose hand was first? All right. Go ahead.
Well, I guess it said about the, they're wanting to be their own gods. Lead their life, they don't live life. I follow the base principles of the law, but they still want to be their own God. And you reminded me of something you said about people explained about what's wrong with instrumental music. And Friday evening, there was a double rainbow in the sky. And you made me think of something like, well, it's always in the same pattern of the primary colors. And the second rainbow was in the same pattern of the primary colors. You never see a rainbow and the colors are switched in different positions. Because God created that pattern to replicate every single time. Every time you replicate His law, you produce a Christian and you produce true worship. You cannot negate the pattern. And so anytime man tries to represent something different, and in something as simple as that rainbow, like, well, what if the second rainbow was in a different sequence of colors?
Right.
It can't be. 2 plus 2 is always 4.
Yeah.
It's because it came from God, and it cannot be changed or adulterated.
Right. God has set a pattern, and it must be followed, because if it's not followed, it's not from God. Right. That is an excellent example. He gives the example of a rainbow, how the colors are always in the same order, and if the rainbow was in a different order, right, it wasn't from God, right? Because God has set the order. Yes, ma'am.
In the first few verses of Luke chapter 14, this kind of same thing happens. It's on the Sabbath day. The Pharisees are, it says, they're watching him closely. They're watching what Jesus is doing. And he heals the man with dropsies. And then he's like, well, if one of your animals fell in a pit on Sabbath day, wouldn't you immediately pull it out? And they didn't have anything to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it wasn't really God's law.
Yeah.
They were taking God's law and pushing it like we saw in Romans 10. It wasn't God's righteousness they were after, it was their own righteousness. And we can do that, we do that today with taking God's concepts of spirituality or how we live our life, and well, we push it a little bit more conservative and more conservative and more conservative. Well, this is a better idea, this is a good idea, this is a good thing to live by.
Yeah.
Which that could very well may be true, but whenever you're trying to condemn other people for not going that far,
Yeah.
that's not right.
Yeah.
So
Luke
it's
4,
legalism at that point.
yeah, Luke 14, pretty much giving the same example. They aren't upset that it's the law. They're upset that it was the traditions that he wasn't following. So showing their hypocrisy, right? Yes, sir.
Kind of the whole picture here. Jesus was never surprised by the Pharisees. He expected the Pharisees. The lesson for us, we should never be surprised by those who speak and work evil against us. We should expect it. And if we don't have it, then what are we really doing?
Right.
You know, the more good we do, the more we should expect that. And like Peter and John, and as we encounter it, we need to mature to the point that we count it as joy.
Right.
And then we've got something out of it.
Yeah. If we are doing good and trouble has not shown up, we need to reconsider whether it is good or not. Because when good is being done, usually trouble follows right after. I'm sure everyone here understands what is being said.
I think we give the Pharisees a bad rap. God was using them to his glory, because somebody had to be the bad guys in this
Right.
story to take
Right.
Jesus to the cross. So
Yeah,
maybe we
God
should-
uses
we should be
everybody
thankful
for his
for their
purpose.
badness.
One last thing, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, so if I was using them and stuff, like, I don't know, physically, like, do you think that they would still be as adamant about what Jesus was doing if it wasn't like a physical appeasing day for them? Like, that was their day of rest, so that's when they got the most pleasure from resting. Like, I know they made it out to be like important, like, oh, the law, and you're like making it look bad, but Jesus was really like taking a moment from that day. Is that?
No, so I think they really just had a problem with Jesus, right? I mean, he could have done it on any day. He did it on Sabbath because he knew their heart. He was making a point, right? But he could have done it on any day, and they would have dragged him to the cross because it wasn't what they were expecting, right? So Jesus has shown his power over everything we can think of: sin, death, sickness, disease, nature. He is the Son of God, and Luke is trying to encourage Theophilus, encourage us to look to the Christ for how we ought to worship, how we ought to be pleasing in the sight of God so that we can ultimately get to heaven. Because if we're not pleasing to God, we will not enjoy the inheritance that's talked about in the book of Romans, that's talked about in the book of Acts, that's talked about in the book of 1 Peter. An inheritance that is incorruptible and undefiled and does not fade away, reserved in heaven for us, that is kept by the powers of God, ready to be revealed in the last day. I forget the last part, right? But if we are not obedient to the gospel, we will not get to heaven. So the invitation is open to those who have not been obedient. To those who have been obedient and have struggles, have questions, comments, concerns, just need the prayers of the congregation. That is what we're here for. Please come forward now as we stand and as we sing.